Good evening. Good. Is this better? Like this? Oh, okay. Usually I can be heard without the microphone, but I'm going to use it this evening. I'm Marcia Goldstone. I'm one of the co-chairs, Catherine Tyler Scott, who couldn't be with us this evening, and I co-chair Task Force 4 for Women for Change. So I want to say welcome to everyone. I know that we are united in our belief that gerrymandering is pernicious for democracy, that it suppresses voter turnout, but that working together, I know that we can make a difference. Women for Change has made it a priority to hold up civility in all that we do. It's not always easy. We open our events with the Civility Pledge, which is led this evening by our own Ann Stack, convener of the Task Force Subcommittee on Gerrymandering.
Please join me. Have these little cards.
Well, then you'll say it and they'll repeat.
I pledge to be civil and respectful in my public discourse and behavior.
I will honor the dignity of others, whether in agreement or disagreement. I will respond to incivility and speak up in the presence of name-calling, stereotypes, slanders, and slurs. I will do this for the sake of our children, for the healing of our country, for the future of democracy and peace. Thank you. Thank you, Ann. The Indiana Coalition for Independent Redistricting really created and has led the campaign against gerrymandering in our state. And it's really the League of Women Voters and Common Cause who are the two lead organizations. Women for Change just has played a role by really adding value to the work of both of these organizations. Just so you know, our particular task force has 3 subcommittees. So in addition to the focus on ending gerrymandering, which we're going to be discussing tonight, we have 2 others. One is led by Bonnie Horlander, who comes to us from Indivisible. That's a focus on ending voter suppression. She works on a voting by mail campaign. We're also interested in using absentee ballots as a technique for encouraging voting as well. And you all know, of course, that the NAA, and who's our host this evening, that the NAA and Common Cause have filed a suit to open more early voting places in Marion County. I mean, right? You don't think it's enough, right? One early voting place in downtown at the courthouse where parking is so easy and it's right, lovely, right? You don't think that's... I live in Carmel and we have 3. Somebody told me who lives in Zionsville they have 8, so it's not a mistake. Our 3rd subcommittee is on civic literacy and is led by Sheila Cease Kennedy. The focus there is on encouraging more high schools in our state to embrace We the People, and also a focus on using book clubs to educate people about how government works. You're also going to hear about a variety of action steps for tonight. I don't want anybody to leave here without signing up for at least one thing, and our sign-up sheets are outside. We're working on model resolutions for city county councils to support independent redistricting. We're working on signing up people to do all sorts of fun things at Elbridge Jerry's birthday party. He's going to have a birthday on July 17th. So we're doing that. Importantly, however, before we get started with Julia, thanks are due to the NAA for hosting us, and we're going to have Ellen Osborne speak in just a second, to Barbara Wallinen, to Holly Brunner, and to Jennifer Atterbury, to all of our Women for Change volunteers, and to Phyllis Carr, who reminded me that we met many years ago when we were both a lot younger. Phyllis Carr, Secretary of the Greater Indianapolis NAA Branch 3050, NAACP, I say NAA, right, CP, NAACP, Branch 3053, for what is a tremendously labor-intensive and invaluable work in getting us here tonight. And now I'm very happy that Ellen Osborne could join us, representing the Greater Indianapolis NAACP branch. I used to say NAA all the time, and I shouldn't. Ellen is the chair of women in NAACP. Ellen.
Well, thank you. Again, my name is Ellen Osborne, and I am the chair of the Indy Wind, we call it committee.
Need to have it up by you.
Indy Wind Committee of the NAACP. And I don't have prepared statements. I learned a short time ago that our president, Ms. Crystal Ratcliffe, was unable to make it. And I'd just like to say thank you for being here and welcome for coming.
Sure the mic's on. It is? You have to hold it up by your, close
Okay.
to your mouth.
Yes, no prepared statements. Thank you all. Greetings from the Greater Indianapolis NAACP, Branch 3053.
Thank you. Okay, now this is really the meat of the evening,
Doesn't sound like it. No,
right?
It's not on.
It's not.
Use your other one.
This is okay, this is really the meat of the evening. Julia Vaughn is the policy director for Common Cause. She and I have known each other for many, many years. This woman is the fount of all knowledge about gerrymandering. It's true. It's really true. She's an extraordinary professional, and she knows this stuff cold, and she's going to help us get rid of gerrymandering in the state of Indiana. Okay, that's what this is all about. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's why we're here, right? We're going to end gerrymandering. So we are well on our way. Thank you all for being here this evening. We're going to start by watching a very short film that was made possible through the generosity of the League of Women Voters of Indiana and Ann Stack. And so that will be our first 10 minutes. And looks like I'm going to have to sign into my computer. Just a second.
Go back to the very beginning to talk about how you talk about redistricting, because the ways that we talked about redistricting in the very beginning infancy of this project really informed the entire success of the project.
When we ask people the term redistricting, what is the opinion that you have of redistricting? 23% say they have a favorable opinion. 39% say they have an unfavorable opinion, and to the extent that you know about redistricting, you tend to be negative. But the overwhelming sentiment here is just a huge number of people who have no idea what we're even talking about. Gerrymandering, interestingly enough, not very well known either, and a lot of people said, who's Jerry? So our strongest message was the will of the people. In America, elections are supposed to represent the will of the people, not the politicians.
I like to tell people that redistricting is sort of part of a web. You know, you want to connect with what is most important to people and then walk them to the tie to redistricting.
This isn't the issue I care about the most, but it's the issue I have to care about first.
Some of the most effective messaging we've seen are, on the one hand, from the Tea Party, and the other hand, from the Occupy movement.
Yeah.
The one thing I see as consistent between these two messages is that the government is no longer under our control. The government is out of control. It doesn't represent us. So I wonder if you could comment on the possible intersection of messaging between Occupy and Tea Party.
The Tea Party and Occupy were different groups, but some people were brought to those causes for similar reasons. I mean, just look at and say, things aren't working the way they should be. The people who are working hard, putting forth the effort, aren't getting ahead, and that people who already have power, whether it's you complain about the government or you complain about business or other parts of society, it seems as if they're the deck is stacked against them. And the whole idea of gerrymandering and redistricting reform fits in with that process.
These messages are very, very strong across party lines. There are almost no discernible difference in terms of the support, and even stronger with independents who feel screwed by everybody.
I do my best to take it from a partisan issue, which is where everybody kind of defaults to, pretty much on everything in politics, but I take it from a partisan issue to an incumbent protection racket, right? And if you can make that conversation shift, then you really start to make headway with everybody. Because the us versus them isn't a left versus right, it's the incumbents versus everybody else. And we really outnumber them when it comes to that, right?
The key is rules. I mean, you can set up an independent commission, you could have legislative staff do it, but the key is you want to have whoever's drawing the maps bound as much as possible by rules that stop the mischief from taking place.
We need to reform the rules and create a fair system so that voters are choosing the politicians instead of politicians choosing the voters. That last phrase, by the way, very, very popular.
And we talked about simplifying the campaign. The campaign was not about Republicans or Democrats. It was about the voters first, letting voters choose their districts. And it had to be that simple. And those of us that worked to write the initiative wanted to talk about all the details. And we'd go back to focus groups, and our consultants, our campaign consultants would say, you have to quit talking about the details. You have to talk about giving the opportunity for voters to choose their elected officials. That's it.
Basically, in this message map, you have to talk about the problem, you have to talk about the solution, and you have to talk about the values. This is an area where you have to establish the problem because people don't know what the problem is. By the way, people also want aspirational, positive messages and solutions. They do not want to be told about another problem that's insolvable. So as you're positioning around redistricting, very, very important to talk about that you have a solution to this problem, or as people said, just don't raise the problem.
If you don't have a coalition of groups in your state who feel that they've had a voice in the process, they've helped shape your reform, that their interests have been heard and considered and have been a part of how you crafted the reform, you're not going to be successful.
It's important, if this is going to be resolved by anything other than the courts, that you bring along people who are not just of one ideological bent or another. This needs to be something that needs to appeal to people who are on the left, on the right, in the middle.
One more thing that I think was very, very instrumental in helping us inform the public about how important this was and how legitimate this was. And that was that we always had a bipartisan board of supporters.
So we worked together to write the initiative, and we worked together to make sure that there was this broad-based coalition. And it was amazing because the amount of time and the amount of energy to put together the language and make sure that we had everyone in the tent was crucial.
I experienced where we're talking about running a campaign or redistricting reform, and we have different definitions of what winning is. What you may define as a victory may not to me be a victory. And instead of talking about how we see that differently, we ignore it or we don't address it. And I think that's problematic because always there's a middle ground if you have a conversation.
One of the things that helped us grow is the redistricting principles for a more perfect union. And we thought those were perfect to form our coalition around. They're broad statements that I think most folks can get behind. So that was sort of the tool that we used to bring people to the table.
Have a real sense of a clear division of labor. So for me, that means that I don't need to be everything to everybody. I need to be in coalition with folks and we're all clear about what our roles are, and we're communicating about that and trying to build a shared strategy around the different things that we do well.
We really have a broad array of groups who have gotten frustrated since 2011 and the Republican supermajorities not only ignoring any forward progress on their issues, but actually taking us backwards. And so, you know, these groups are very, very motivated. They feel like they're just going to spin their wheels until we get this fundamental redistricting reform in place. So it's really been surprisingly easy to bring people into the coalition.
We had legislators, we had city councils that understood what we were trying to do, and we had a business community, the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the California Chamber of Commerce. So we were able to bring all different groups together to recognize that this was the way that we could end gridlock.
We had to fight, scratch, claw for a committee hearing for this bill. We got it only after flooding the State House with thousands and thousands of calls and messages. Then we didn't get a vote. And so people really felt like the rug was pulled out from under them. We had 24 hours notice of this hearing. We were able to get 300 people to the State House. There's not been any other issue this session that has attracted that many members of the public. So we were really cheated out of any resolution. So I was really concerned as I walked away from that hearing. We had people who, this was their first trip to the State House, the first legislative hearing they had ever attended. And I thought, oh, what a horrible taste to leave in their mouth. And so I was expecting all of these emails from people saying, take me off your mailing list, I will never darken the door of the Indiana State House again. Just the opposite has happened. People seem resolved. The message has been, we knew this wasn't going to be easy. We knew what we were up against. That was done at a conference down at Duke University in March, where we heard from a lot of the experts around the country, not only on redistricting, but with a particular focus on the litigation that we learned on Monday is indeed headed to the Supreme Court of the United States. Whitford versus Gill will get an audience before the Supreme Court of the United States. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the PowerPoint. But that Monday was just a really, really good day for redistricting reform advocates, because in addition to hearing what we expected that the Supreme Court would take up Whitford versus Gill, we also had a victory in one of the most Republican stronghold areas in Indiana. The Carmel City Council unanimously passed the Indiana Coalition for Independent Redistricting resolution in support of reform. That is big, so give yourselves a hand, because that happened only because of citizen advocacy. So we are on our way in Hamilton County. Watch out, Fishers and Noblesville, you will be next. And you know, it's important because these are elected officials who are like the farm team for the Indiana legislature, saying to the Indiana legislature, you need to clean up your act. And as Councilor Ron Carter in Carmel, as he was talking about the bill on Monday, he said what this really boils down to, are you for gerrymandering or are you against it? And that is exactly right. So the Carmel City Council formally and officially said on Monday that they are opposed to gerrymandering. So I think that's a great thing, and thank you to the folks who helped make that happen. So we're here tonight to give you a really, really strong background in this issue. We need you going out to your friends, your family, your groups, the organizations that you belong to, maybe some organizations that you don't belong to, but you can infiltrate in some way. And we need you taking this message out across Indiana. Because as we heard in the video from Celinda Lake, one of the most respected pollsters in the country, just not enough people know about this. And it's growing a tremendous amount. Let me tell you, I've been working on this issue since 1995, and I can remember when we would struggle to get 20 people in a room to talk about redistricting. That's not the case anymore. But we have a long way to go till we have the critical mass of people who truly understand what we're talking about when we talk about putting citizens in control of the redistricting process. So we are well on our way, but we've got a long way to go. So let's start. Okay. Just a brief introduction to Common Cause. We've been around since 1970. We were founded by a guy named John Gardner. He was the only Republican to serve in the administration of Lyndon Johnson. He was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He got kind of disgusted with the federal government because of the growing involvement in the Vietnam War, so he resigned that position, and in 1970, he founded what was then the first grassroots citizens lobby in the country. And that sounds really weird because they are so common today, but really John Gardner started something new back in 1970. The first chairman of our governing board is a guy who I think we're hearing a lot about in the news. He's Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor for Watergate, was the first chairman of the Common Cause Board of Directors. So we work for open, honest, and accountable government. We're all about reducing the influence of money on the electoral and legislative processes. So we're into campaign finance reform, lobbying, legislative ethics, open government, voting and election issues, redistricting reform. We obviously are involved in lobbying, but we go to court. As was mentioned earlier, we have joined with the NAACP, both the state and Indianapolis organization, in challenging in federal court the lack of early voting options for voters here in Marion County. So we also litigate and do a lot of public education work. To follow us, please seek us out on Facebook and Twitter. You can sign up for action alerts at commoncause.org. As was mentioned, I think by Marcia, back in 2014, we, along with the League of Women Voters of Indiana, helped form the Indiana Coalition for Independent Redistricting. We number quite a few groups, including the Sierra Club Beyond Coal campaign, Moms Demand Action, Indiana Coalition for Human Services. I won't read them all out there. But we do need more conservative groups, the point that was made in the video. Our coalition is real heavy on progressives, but we really haven't cracked the conservatives too much, and we need to do that. I was excited that during the debate on House Bill 1014, a testimony that we had in the House chamber, the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce stood up, and that was very, very important support. We are hoping to use the Indianapolis Chamber to network with other local chambers of commerce and hopefully put some pressure on the State Chamber of Commerce, which is extremely influential in the State House. We need their participation on this issue. So if any of you are small business owners and you belong to the Chamber of Commerce, it would really, really be helpful for you to start talking to their staff people, to their, chair people of the local organizations about how redistricting is a really important issue for the business community. Another thing that happened this week, there was an article published by Mickey Maurer in the Indianapolis Business Journal that talked about how redistricting reform is an important issue for businesses, that we're getting bad legislation because of the gerrymandering that's going on at both the congressional and state levels. So we're really, really working, and we hope you can help us get more action going on in conservative causes and within the business community. This is one of my favorite graphics. I think it does a really good job of explaining gerrymandering in a graphic way. You've got a district of 50 people that's 60% blue and 40% red, you can see that the first example would be the perfect representation of that sort of voter breakdown. This is sort of the scenario that we've got here in Indiana right now. One of the things that the State House Republicans who drew the maps in 2011 like to point out is that, oh, our districts are nice and compact. But just recognize that you can have nice compact districts that are indeed gerrymandered. And then the inverse of that, of course, is the more tortured and contorted districts that can be drawn. But, you know, these two things, while they look very different, they're still gerrymandering. And obviously a way to manipulate the intent of voters. So let's get real basic as we get into this issue, and I know that most of you know this, but you know, most of us, we learned this back in high school and government, and it's been a while, so I think a refresher is good. So why do we do this exercise every 10 years? Do we just, you know, like to play with maps? Why do we do this? Well, we do it because we have to reinforce the notion of one person, one vote. And of course, you know, we aren't a static society. People move between towns and between neighborhoods and between states, and people die and they're born. So our population is always changing, right? And so every 10 years, we do a federal census. So it is no coincidence that we redistrict the year after the federal census, because that's the whole point of it, is to even the districts up population-wise. And of course, we didn't always do this. A lot of states just, you know, they didn't bother to redistrict. And so it wasn't until 1964, in a Supreme Court case called Baker versus Carr, that states were forced to, every 10 years after the federal census, redraw your congressional districts and your state legislative districts. So the whole idea is really pretty straightforward. It is to get an accurate count, not only of the total number of people that you have in your state, but then to also apportion them into districts that are relatively even in population. And so in Indiana and in most states, control of that process is given to the state legislature. And that, of course, is where the problem comes in. Because we've given the job to the people who are absolutely the most self-interested in the outcome. So what could go wrong, right? Well, a lot of stuff could go wrong. So let's talk about that. And overall, the goal is safe districts. It is an incumbent protection racket. I really like what Brian from the Virginia Coalition said. That's what it is. It's about reducing competition so that voters aren't relevant. And they've done a really good job of that here in Indiana, and it has impacted voter turnout negatively. Because in all of our congressional districts, and in the vast majority of Indiana House and Indiana Senate, the nice maps that are representing that over here, there is no competition. And so it's no wonder why our state was dead last in voter turnout in 2014. For too many people, there really isn't any reason to vote because there's only one major party candidate on the ballot for most races. So it really is a waste of time. And people have found better ways to spend their time. So let's talk a little bit about, and in 2011, I think it's important to recognize that it was different than the previous two times that we redistricted, because in 91 and 2001, Democrats controlled the Indiana House of Representatives. So they had their version of the maps. The Republicans who controlled the Indiana Senate had their versions in 91 and 2001. Now, let me make clear, it is not as if Democrats are saints and they have never, ever gerrymandered in Indiana, because they did. That's one of the ways that, they had control of the Indiana House, was clever drawing of the maps. But I emphasize this point so that you can recognize what the outcome was in 2011 when Democrats didn't have a seat at the table. The outcome has been Republican supermajorities, because there was no push and pull of Democrats saying, we like our version of the maps that we drew in the House, and the Senate Republicans saying, no, 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 we like our versions. And the natural compromise that happens in the legislative process. There's no compromise when one party controls the whole thing. And the same would be true if Democrats were controlling the whole thing. The problem is you can't allow the players to also be the umpires. And that is what we are doing. So, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this. I think you people are here because you recognize the problems. We've talked about how non-competitive elections hurt turnout, and it fuels apathy. People say, well, why in the world would I call my legislator? It's that idiot who, keeps getting reelected and they don't listen to me. And so people don't participate because, there's nobody challenging the status quo. Communities of interest can be ignored, and a community of interest is a town, a city, a neighborhood, and a really good district example of a community of interest is the east side of Indianapolis, which is now included in a state Senate district with the small town of Greenfield. And the state senator lives in Greenfield. And I know a whole lot of people who live on the Near East Side of Indianapolis who say, who is this Mike Kreider guy? I've never seen him, I don't know him. And what does he know in Greenfield about what we're dealing with here on the Near East Side of Indianapolis? And I think those are very valid questions. Senator Kreider may be a really nice guy, and he may be working real hard, but it's probably hard for him to do a good job for all of his constituents because they're radically different communities who probably have some conflicting needs sometimes. So, we have safe seats. When a legislator doesn't have to worry about the voters when it's time to get reelected, when all they have to do is keep the party boss happy and a few campaign contributors, good luck getting response from them. So we need more responsive legislators, and we think that less safe seats will be a good way to do that. Polarization in politics. Where we have competition in Indiana election, it comes at primary election time, when a tiny percentage of the electorate is participating. And in Republican district, those challenges will come from the right. And so many of the Republicans who I talk to, who are working for redistricting reform, are supporting this issue because they understand that the future of their party is at stake. And that if they want to return the Republican Party to the place where they think it should be, which is the middle, they've got to have redistricting reform and quit electing ideologues from safe districts who are only challenged come primary election time. Tracking campaign contributions is made difficult through gerrymandering because we have very few competitive districts, yet everybody raises campaign money. So those folks who are raising campaign money but don't have any opponent at re-election time give it to somebody else who does have competition, and you don't know where that money came from. It makes it much harder to track than if it went through the regular campaign finance system and wasn't a candidate transfer. So it can make it hard to follow the money in politics, which is something that my organization is always trying to do. It skews the will of the voters. You know, is Indiana a 80% Republican state? But our state Senate is 80% Republican, right? So we must be. It must be that 80% of the votes that were cast for Indiana Senate went to Republican candidates. It must be. But no, it wasn't. In fact, I can't remember the statistics for the Senate, but in the House, Republicans won 57% of the votes, but they ended up with 69% of the seats. So that's skewing the will of the voters. That's thwarting the will of the electorate, and that's a misrepresentation of what Indiana really is. Now, redistricting reform is not going to turn a red state blue. We will probably still have Republican majorities inside the Indiana General Assembly with redistricting reform, but what we won't have are Republican supermajorities. We'll have divides that more accurately reflect the vote totals and more accurately reflect the will of the voters in this state. So that's a very big plus. And then finally, racial gerrymandering. You know, the Supreme Court will, late this year, for the first time, take up the issue of partisan gerrymandering, and is it unconstitutional? But as you all know, since the mid-60s, the court has been dealing with racial gerrymandering cases. And it would be nice to think, after how many decades, or like 60 years now? It'd be nice to think that they've stopped this stuff. That they've stopped trying to pack and crack minority voters to dilute their political impact, but it's still happening, folks, isn't it? Just last month, North Carolina lost yet another redistricting case, as did Texas. They've been on the losing end of I've lost count. So racial gerrymandering is alive and well in the United States. It's been used now for decades to either pack minority voters into a few districts to prevent them from impacting their will on a larger number of districts, or the opposite is cracking, where you divide them up so that there's not enough in any one district so that they have a chance of electing the representation of their choice. So I wish I could say that, oh, that racial gerrymandering thing, that's just something that we learned about in the history books, but unfortunately, it is still practiced today. So how are we going to end this? Well, we've got to put into Indiana statute before 2021, because that will be the next time that Indiana redistricts. We need an independent redistricting commission. The key question to this group of people is, how are they selected? And California absolutely has the best model. We need to worry about if this group is bipartisan. One of the things that I thought was interesting about the debate in the Indiana General Assembly is this year was that legislators kept trying to twist it into nonpartisan. We want a nonpartisan group, and well, those people don't exist. Everybody has a political bias. Well, I know a lot of people who are actually nonpartisan and very independent in their thinking, but I can understand certainly how legislators would think those people don't exist. But that isn't what we're talking about. We are talking about bipartisan. We want a group, and frankly, tripartisan would be better. We think libertarians deserve a seat at the table. You know, they have achieved ballot access in Indiana, which is not an easy thing to do. So they should have a seat at the table. So tripartisan would be better. Now, unfortunately, there are only Republicans and Democrats inside the General Assembly, so it's going to be hard to get libertarians a seat at the table. But that's something we've always fought for, and that it shouldn't be dominated by just Republicans and Democrats, that independents and libertarians should have a seat at the redistricting table as well. We need to make sure that these people represent the diversity of Indiana voters, and diversity in a lot of different ways. Geographic diversity. We don't need just a bunch of people from Indianapolis deciding what's going to work for the entire state. We need people from all over the state. We need people to represent minority voters in this state. We certainly need gender representation as well. So let's create a group of people that actually looks like Indiana voters, and let's make sure that this process is transparent and that it provides opportunities for meaningful citizen input and involvement. We need to have software, the same software that the Independent Commission would use to draw maps, needs to be made available on a website so that you can sit at your home computer at 2 a.m. and draw the districts that you think would be appropriate. And, send those to the commission and say, have you thought about this as an alternative? So we really need to have a process that makes it easy for citizens to participate. The last 2 rounds of redistricting, the state has gone to the expense, bless their little hearts, of buying software, incredibly difficult to use software, and setting it up on computers at 3 IU campuses, South Bend, here in Indianapolis, and in Bloomington, and saying to the public, oh, there's your software, have at it. No technical assistance. You've got to drive to the university campus, pay to park. I believe there were a grand total of 3 people who used that setup in 2011. So come on, state, don't pretend like you have a system that's accessible or a process that's accessible. It's the 21st century. We should do something that's web-based. So some key, as I mentioned, the really key question when you start talking about how are we going to come up with this bipartisan commission. In California, as I said, they have really a fascinating process that has figured out how to sever politics and a redistricting commission. We aren't likely to get that here, but let me explain it to you very briefly. They have a state department, it's called the Bureau of State Audits. 3 people are randomly chosen, auditors who work at the California Bureau of State Audits, a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent. That's easy for them to figure out because in California, you register to vote by a political party or as an independent. So that's well established, which is not the case here. But anyway, which is one of the problems we have translating the California system to Indiana. So anyway, these auditors go to work one day and they are informed, guess what? You are now in charge of the selection process for the California Redistricting Commission. And those lucky team, that lucky team of 3 people in 2011 got to sort through 30,000 applications. Because this is open to any registered voter in the state who would like to participate. Now, putting your name in the hat is not as simple as emailing somebody and saying, hey, pick me. It's quite involved. And in fact, you have to answer essay questions. What are your analytical skills that would lend themselves for you to assume this position? And so it's not something that people do on a whim, yet 30,000 people in California were excited enough about this opportunity that they took the time to do it. So somehow this team of 3 auditors, they sorted through those applications. They figured out, okay, this one's not qualified, this one probably not. It's kind of like a jury selection process because the legislature got the opportunity to strike a few. It was, uh-oh, I remember her. No, we don't want her. So then it's left to a random draw. And so they pick the first 7 randomly. It's a lottery. They have them in 3 bundles, so they're making sure they know when they're picking a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent. So they pick 7 that way, and then those 7 pick the next 7 out of the pool that was qualified by the team of 3 auditors. So it's genius. It's really genius. And it worked so well in 2011 that everybody in California gave that process much higher marks than the previous process that had been like ours in most other states, where it's done behind closed doors and, you know, the legislators, the people who are most conflicted, have the say. They held more than 200 public hearings across the state of California, all of it broadcast via the internet. So this group that was really representative of voters in the state also carried out an incredibly transparent and easy to participate in process. So that's the gold standard. We're probably not going to get that here. We're probably going to have to figure out a way that gives the legislature some say in this. The Indiana Coalition for Independent Redistricting did develop a proposal that melded some of the key parts of the California selection process, but then allowed the Legislative Council to be the selectors, but also incorporated a lottery or random draw for some of these selections. So we're continuing to try to fight for a way that provides some separation from legislative leaders doing the appointing of the Redistricting Commission, but we've got a lot of talking to do before we gain much traction on that in the General Assembly. There's been some attention here in Indiana paid to the Iowa system, which is very unique. They are the only state that has a system like theirs. Basically, the Legislative Services Agency, which is the state staff to the Iowa legislature, they are in charge of drawing the maps. They have very strict statutory criteria that directs them to keep counties whole whenever possible. We have never advocated for the Iowa system here in Indiana for a couple of key reasons. The first is that Iowa has almost no diversity. And if you start drawing districts in Indiana the way they draw them in Iowa, you would start cramming minority voters into a few districts. You would probably run afoul of the Voting Rights Act very quickly because we just have much higher levels of minority citizens here in Indiana, and they tend to be clustered in urban areas. So we think our demographics are not appropriate to model Iowa. The other problem with Iowa is that they seem to have a less partisan General Assembly. There seems to be a just higher sense of fair play, less bloodthirst in their politics. And quite frankly, we've had some candid conversation with legislative services staffers who say, we would never want this job in Indiana. You know, we understand very clearly who we work for, and we would not want this job. Please do not advocate an Iowa model. So that rings really true to me. If people who staff the agency say, no, this would be a really bad idea, I think we should listen to them. Another thing that's really important, and that was absent in the bill that came out of the Legislative Study Committee, was that commission members have to be paid. You know, this is going to be a lengthy process. This is hard work. And you can't expect people to volunteer their time and say, oh, hey, job, yeah, I'll be back in a month. I'm going to go be doing this redistricting commission thing. Because if we set it up like that, then we're going to predispose participation by wealthy people who don't have to go to work. And we don't want to do that. So this is a job, and it is important to pay people for a job. So commission members deserve to be paid. So that's the who, and the who part of this question is really important, but the how part is equally as important, as was also mentioned in the video. We've got to spell out in state statute the directions that this commission, this bipartisan commission of citizens should follow. So the first two are easy because the federal courts say, number one, it's equal population. That's why we're doing this anyway. You can have up to a 2% variation. The Indiana districts that we have right now, they are not even 2%. It's more like 1 or 2 people equal in population. So they could actually deviate a little bit more so that they could take care of some of the other criteria, but so far in Indiana, we haven't worried about any other criteria. Other than the Voting Rights Act, we do have to be careful not to crack minority voters, because if you do that, you're going to run afoul of the Voting Rights Act. Other things to consider, which we are arguing as we take our debate to the General Assembly, is compactness is important, where you can draw communities to be a compact group. That's good, because it's more likely that people will recognize who their representatives are, and it'll be easier for the representative to get around, like the example I spoke of earlier, where we've got the state senator who lives in Greenfield, but then he represents these voters in Indianapolis 20 miles away. And I hear, you know, they don't see him too much on the Near East side of Indianapolis. So compactness is important. And again, for that same example, communities of interest. What do Greenfield and the Near East side have in common? You know, we think you should keep communities of interest together. Another example is Senate District 29. A speaker at the Carmel City Council mentioned this. Goes from Westfield up in Hamilton County to West 34th Street in Indianapolis. Right. Yeah. Little gerrymandering going on here. Competition. This is the big one. We think where you can draw districts to be competitive, to create contests between Republicans and Democrats, you should try to do that. Now, there are those who say, but you know, you can't do that everywhere. And you're right, you can't do it everywhere. In Lake County, North Lake County, it's going to be hard to draw a Republican district and respect communities of interest. You could draw one, and they've drawn some that have elected Republicans because they snake down into southern Lake County and pick up a lot of Republican voters. But, you know, again, there's more natural competition that exists in Indiana than the handful of seats that are competitive now. And certainly at the congressional level. We've got 9 congressional districts, and during our previous decade, 4 of them used to go back and forth, remember? Remember the Bloody Eight? They used to call the district down in Bloomington and southwestern Indiana the Bloody Eighth, because it was so competitive, and every 2 years, you know, the Republicans and Democrats duked it out. Guess what? That helped turnout, because people knew that their vote could really make a difference. So competition is really important. I don't think it's surprising that incumbent legislators don't want to talk about it. You know, if you can skate into re-election, you'd probably choose to do that rather than actually have to run. But as citizens, I think we have to demand, again, going back to the video, that they put voters first. And including competition as a criteria would be a way to do that. Nesting involves creating Senate districts by simply putting 2 House districts together. That kind of makes it easy, but we think it also, on the other hand, ties your hands and could make it harder to fulfill some of the other criteria. So that's what nesting is. And then finally, incumbent blind. You know, the idea of not considering the incumbent's home address when you start drawing districts. And that's important because in Indiana in 2011, I will give Republicans credit. They did an awful lot of gerrymandering, but in the Indiana House of Representatives, for the first time, they drew districts incumbent blind, and because of that, several incumbents, both Republicans and Democrats, ended up in districts with another incumbent, and so had to run against one of their peers. In fact, one of the most powerful Republicans in the State House, Jeff Espick, who was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, ended up in a district with another Republican, and it ended his legislative career. He decided to not run again rather than run against a fellow Republican. So we think that's the way it should be. You know, it's not their district. They are elected to represent the district for the people, but it doesn't belong to them. Therefore, the district shouldn't be drawn around their home addresses. Now, Republicans in the Indiana Senate have raised this issue. They say that there is this problem, and we have to consider incumbent addresses in the Senate, and here's why. You know, they aren't all elected at the same time. Unlike the Indiana House, where all 100 stand for re-election every 2 years, in the Senate they have staggered terms. So half of them will be up in 2022, and then the other half, the other 25, will be up in 2024. So here is the insurmountable problem. What if someone who's up for re-election in 2024 is put in a district with someone who's up in 2022? I mean, what would we do? Well, you and I wouldn't do anything, right? Because it doesn't affect us. And it's really not a problem for the voters. It's a problem for that one individual. And there are solutions to the problem. They could move, and people have done that. Many a person has moved to save their legislative seat. Todd Rokita, right? They drew him out of his district in 2011. Take that for talking about redistricting reform. That's what that was all about. But anyway, it's not a problem because there will be a solution. Individuals will decide that I'm going to move, or I'm not going to run, or maybe I'll run for the House because I'm in that district. So, you know, again, it's a problem only potentially for 50 people in a state of 6.6 million people. So I don't think we need to write public policy to suit the needs of 50 people. We need to write it to suit the needs of 6.6 million people. Okay, and then the last thing, allow legislature a final, I'm jumping over. Arizona has a really good model for this whole idea of communities of interest because it's kind of a vague term, right? It's any area where people have common concerns or interests. So the way Arizona kind of hones in on that is their redistricting commission, the very first thing they do is hold town meetings all over the state. And they've got a big map and they say, come show us your community of interest, and we're gonna pin it on the map here so that the redistricting commission will recognize as they start drawing district lines, oh, here's a Navajo reservation, or here's the Yuma School District. Or, you know, so they will recognize what is the landscape behind the districts that they're drawing. So that would be a great thing to incorporate in a new law here. And finally, we do believe that the legislature, they're going to have to play a role in this for reasons we'll discuss later. But we do think it makes sense to give them not carte blanche in terms of changing the maps that the commission has drawn, but give them a final, small, contained tweak, because legislators do know their districts well, and they might recognize a problem that has been inadvertently created. So, we went through this 18-month process. The public really stepped up and put a tremendous amount of pressure, came out to these study committee hearings. It was a group of legislators and citizens. I think the Speaker of the House, Brian Bosma, really showed us that he is on our side through his appointment to the Special Interim Committee. He is the person who gave Democrats a majority on that committee and thereby ensured that we would get a pro-reform recommendation out of that. And he did that by following the recommendation that our coalition made to appoint Justice Ted Boehm as his citizen representative. So that was really, really key. The pro-reform recommendation passed 7-3. Those of you who followed it know that the 3 no votes came from the Republican Senate nominees. They just said, gerrymandering, what gerrymandering? You all have not established the problem, so therefore we're not going to support any kind of solution. So the recommendation that 7 members of the commission passed became House Bill 1014. So House Bill 1014 included language that would have created a 9-member commission that was appointed by the legislative leadership. It did create some things that would prohibit certain people from being involved, so no elected officials, no party officials, no lobbyists. But that only went back 6 years, and that created some concerns for us. One of the most controversial parts of this recommendation, they created a nominating commission. Now, this group would not actually appoint people, but they would nominate a group of 12 that the legislative leaders could choose from when making appointments. And this was controversial because it included the Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court and the 3 largest university presidents, which would be the president of Purdue, Mitch Daniels, which is why it was very controversial for some people, as well as the presidents of IU and Ball State. So those people, all appointed by the legislative leadership, that would be 8 people, they would choose the 9th. And the language did say that this group should be diverse. We had some problems with 1014. I've already talked about, we think it's problematic when you don't create much separation between legislative appointments and commission members. One of the real glaring omissions in terms of disqualifications, a legislator's wife could have been a member of the commission. Their brother, their husband, sister-in-law, son, daughter-in-law. So we think family members should be excluded. They spent pages trying to regulate ex parte communication, meaning they would have allowed secret communications between members of the commission and legislators, people who are going to be directly impacted by the maps. No, just don't allow secret conversations, because it's impossible to regulate them. You know, they created this whole system where they were supposed to write down the conversation they had, and then they'd go file it somewhere, and the public's supposed to know which filing cabinet in Government Center South, you go look for this. No, just no ex parte communications. There was no pay for commission members. They would have gotten a daily per diem, but, that would have just covered their living expenses. And it was extremely vague on how the public would participate and how we would know what was going on. So those were some issues we had. I won't dwell on this, but we have provided the study committee and the legislature with a much different approach, which melds the California process with what we think are just good Hoosier common sense ideas. Again, more of our approach. Again, we talked about competition and compactness, but only when they do not negatively impact other criteria like respect for the Voting Rights Act and equal population. We also think we need to define community of interest in the statute. So what happened to House Bill 1014? How many of you were there on February? Yeah, it was disappointing, wasn't it? I mean, we had such high hopes. I mean, we had to keep fighting for that hearing. We were down to almost the deadline, and we got it. It was Valentine's Day, the day they posted it. And I was like, oh, this is the best Valentine's Day present ever. And so we got on Facebook and we notified everybody, and 300 people showed up. It was amazing. Really amazing. And the energy in the room was great, and it was just wonderful. And then Milo Smith, well, I don't know. This bill has problems. Well, that's why you have amendments, Milo. So clearly he was making an excuse, and we can, analyze it. I think one of the big problems was Chairman Smith had no investment in 1014. He hadn't been a member of the study committee. And I remember thinking when that happened back in 2015, that's kind of weird. Usually they put the committee chair where this legislation would be going on the study committee, so that's kind of weird. And I think he thought that was kind of weird too, and kind of disrespectful. And this was his way to say to the speaker, yeah, maybe next time you'll include me in these discussions. So I think that as we work this summer, we're talking to Milo Smith because, over the years, he has never told me I'm opposed to redistricting reform. And in fact, he led us to believe that he liked things in our proposal more than he liked what came out of the study committee. So there was some weird stuff going on, but I do think that Representative Smith just, he felt a little disrespected, and this was his way to tell the speaker, next time, remember, I'm the chair of the elections committee. So that was part of it. We also had really bad timing, because we were coming down to those end days before things have to cross over to the next chamber, and so was the road funding package. And Republicans were in a really weird position because they were advocating tax increases. And, many of them have taken pledges that they would never, ever, under any circumstances, support a tax increase. So they really, really, really had to beat up their caucus to get the necessary votes on that to pass a state budget, which is, of course, really their only job. And so when it came time to beat people up for redistricting reform, the leadership had had enough fighting, and so had the people they were fighting with. And so it was just like, no, we're not going to fight anymore. And so our timing was bad because we got just mixed up with the road funding debate. I don't think it is any coincidence that of the members of the election committee, 7 of them are in uncompetitive districts where they ran unopposed in the general election. So I think that has something to do with it as well. There really is not any consensus on reform either. Even though we had this 18-month study committee process, there was never really any coalescing around House Bill 1014. As I mentioned, it had just some controversial stuff. It was really weighed down by that university president piece, which was really kind of silly because, again, they didn't have nominating authority. All they were going to be doing was, recommending a list of 12 people. But we have some anti-intellectual legislators who just don't like universities. I'm not kidding. It's really true. And just frankly, while I do appreciate Speaker Bosma, and he is one of the reasons why we've gotten this far, he did not do enough for us this year. So we are going to have some conversations with him. And I am really outraged by this whole excuse that, oh, well, in the House, we didn't need to take a vote because the Senate would have killed it. So that means you don't stand up for what's right? That is no excuse, and it's really disappointing that Bosma tried to play that as a rational reason not to move forward. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the excuses that we've heard from members of the General Assembly. I'm sure some of you have heard this one. There was this article in the Washington Post, and they did a study, and they found that Indiana districts are just some of the best. Well, that's overstating it quite a bit. Actually, what the Washington Post did was not a study. They had a reporter take a look at congressional districts only. So that's a big qualifier too, right? Congressional districts only, and they were only looking at compactness. So, they didn't say we had some of the best. They said our congressional districts are some of the most compact. And obviously, if you recall from the graphic we showed at the beginning, you can have compact districts that are quite gerrymandered. There are other folks who are saying, well, I might support this, but we can't do it legislatively. You've got to have a constitutional amendment. No. The legislature will still be involved. They will pass what other maps the commission comes up with. We have on good authority former Indiana Supreme Court Justice Ted Boehm, a Democrat, and Brent Dixon, a Republican, sent a letter to the General Assembly saying, we believe House Bill 1014 is constitutional. The General Assembly will still have involvement in this process, even if you use a redistricting commission. So we don't need a constitutional amendment to do this. And then there are those folks who are just in denial about gerrymandering. I win 70%, and that is evidence that I am the greatest legislator ever, and they love me. Well, then you have nothing to fear with redistricting. And certainly, as a Republican, you understand that competition is good. It's good for business, it's good in sports, it should be good for politics too. That's just a good Republican principle. We need to get going. I know I'm moving forward. All right, we just need a bigger team inside the General Assembly. We're working on a public campaign with yard signs, bumper stickers, all of those traditional things. We're going to be doing a big kickoff on Organization Day, which will be either November 14th or November 22nd. We have got to make this a big issue in the 2018 state legislative campaigns, and we intend to do that by making a pledge campaign. We need to have voters going to legislators asking them to take a pledge to support redistricting reform. Our silver bullet, and I think I will stop here, You all just heard me mention it. On Monday, the Supreme Court announced that they will be taking up the Whitford versus Gill case. This is the first time it's been developed an objective standard that can measure maps that have been gerrymandered to the point that voters are irrelevant. So this is an extremely big deal. The key takeaway is that Justice Kennedy, let's hope he takes his vitamins, that he's working out, and that his parents lived very long lives, because he is the swing vote, and this efficiency gap has been developed with him in mind. So it's time for your questions. The question, in case you didn't hear it, was, are only registered voters counted for purposes of redistricting? And no, it's citizens. So everybody, and this was actually, there was a challenge out of Texas, of all states. This was something that was resolved by the Supreme Court earlier. They wanted to only count registered voters. And of course, that would have excluded children, people who, can't be registered, as well as those people who choose not to be registered. So we dodged a bullet there. Had the Supreme Court said, oh no, you only count people who are registered, that would have changed things dramatically. But so far, the courts have ruled almost exclusively the right way in all of these gerrymandering challenges. So that's one place where we are winning. Other questions?
What are the top 1, 2, or 3 things that people in this room can do to help?
Absolutely. Well, what you can do is take this issue back to the organizations that you belong to. Whether it's a book club, whether it's a social justice group at your church or temple or other faith community, whether it's your neighborhood crime watch. I mean, this is absolutely a neighborhood issue. So take it back and start talking to people and explaining to them why this is important. And I say that because, let's go back to the video. Celinda Lake reminded us that it's like a quarter of the people even know what we're talking about when we say redistricting and gerrymandering. So you can absolutely help raise the level of awareness. So just talking to individuals, but particularly organizations. The League of Women Voters, I brought just a few copies with me because it's multiple pages, a little expensive to copy, but I can email this to everybody. If you could host a house party for reform. Who of us doesn't like to get together with friends and family? This does not have to be fancy. But we take you through it just step by step. We provide you with links to really good videos that are brief and that are funny and that will help break the ice. And again, get this conversation started. So you could host a house party for reform. And then last but not least, on July 17th, Elbridge Gary is turning, I don't know, if he was alive, he'd be like 300 or something. He's been dead for 203 years. Elbridge is the father of gerrymandering. And we have been using his birthday on July 17th to hold events to call attention to the need for reform. We will be down at the south steps of the Indiana State House. We are going to have speakers. Carrie Hamilton, State Rep Carrie Hamilton is confirmed. Megan Robertson with Enterprise Republicans. Sandy Sasso is going to debut this wonderful poem that she has written. And we are going to play a special game that goes along with it. It's called Pin the Tail on the Gerrymander Monster. And best of all, we will have birthday cake. And we will be getting media coverage. It's really important that we have a good turnout for that, to remind legislators that, you may have gone home for the summer, But we're still working for redistricting reform, and when you come back in 2018, we intend to make this the biggest issue. And then I guess I'll go on to 4. As I mentioned, November 14th or 22nd, if you can come back to the Indiana State House, that will be organization day for the 2018 General Assembly. And again, we need to have a big kickoff. We need to be just a constant reminder to legislators that this is the issue that we're not going to let go.
Can
There's one right
I
there.
ask a question here or not?
Oh.
What do you predict for the Supreme Court? Will they wait until after the 2018 election to make a verdict, a decision?
No. We expect that they'll take it up late this year, and so we would expect a verdict in early 2018 before the elections. Now, they did, that the decision earlier this week was kind of a two-parter. They decided, yes, we will take up the case, but we're not going to order the state of Wisconsin to redraw their maps before the 2018. So I don't know how that will be resolved. A lot of people are trying to infer in that we're going to have a bad decision in Whitford. I think that's reading too much too soon.
Okay, and another would be on the who appropriates the money for the commissions, either in California or Arizona, for
It's
the
a
commission?
standing, yeah. The legislature appropriates the money, but it's a standing appropriation that increases with inflation, so they don't have to come back to the legislature. It's pretty secure funding so that the legislature can't mess with the commission by messing with their funding. That's a good question.
I had kind of a two-parter too.
Okay.
One, I really appreciated your statistic, but I didn't write down the percentages quick enough about the percentage of voters for certain candidates, but yet the final outcome was much higher. It was like 57% and 69%.
Yeah, that's from 2014. I don't use the 2016 statistics. They're a little less striking to show our picture, but that's because it was a presidential election year, and so that really throws statistics off. But the 2014, excuse me, numbers, I'm going to cough, was for Indiana House candidates, and I've got a fact sheet that I can share with you where it's written down for you. 57% of the total votes went to Republican candidates, but they ended up with 69 out of 100 seats.
Okay. And then the second part of it, and then I'm going to give it to you because your hand's been up the whole time. What is the argument for gerrymandering? I mean, is it just it's not a problem? It's just a denial that there's a problem?
Well, there's that. There's the denial of the problem, and Sandy and I were talking earlier, and she brought this up, that people, gerrymandering, what gerrymandering? Hamilton County's just Republican, and there's nothing you can do about that. And Lake County's just Democrat, and there's nothing you can do about that. And yeah, there are those types of areas in Indiana, but then there are the Logansports, and the Porter County, and the LaPorte County, and the places where natural competition exists. And so again, we can't look at this district by district and say, oh, well, we can't have 100 competitive districts, so there's just no point. There's more natural competition in Indiana than what is represented by our political districts now. And if we have a group of citizens who are using common sense and nonpartisan criteria to guide them, and particularly if one of those criteria is draw districts to be competitive when you can, then absolutely we will end up with more competition in our elections than we currently have. So it is just this denial that, oh, this is people self-sorting. They will talk about, oh, those people who used to vote Democrat in southern Indiana, they just don't vote Democrat anymore. The people who I talk to are mostly independent. And, they absolutely vote for candidates. This all becomes self-fulfilling when you have districts that were drawn to eliminate competition. Sometimes people vote Republican because that's the only people who are running. You know, I hear that from people who live in Hendricks County all the time. Well, sure, I vote Republican because I wouldn't be voting otherwise, you know. So yeah, it is just a denial of the problem, or it's people who say, well, the Indiana Constitution gives us this job, so we just absolutely can't delegate it to anybody else.
Yes. Ooh, I'm full disclosure, I currently live in Greenfield. I think that this has become sort of a hot button issue because it looks like it's a liberal, sore loser Democrat issue. In Greenfield, in Hancock County, we're trying to resurrect League of Women Voters. And I think it's through an organization like that, which has been it used to moderate the debates. Right. It has for decades been sort of viewed as that best representation of how we've described our work through Women for Change, that the chasm between us is not, it's a short bridge, and we walk across it all the time. We could really use support. We are having a meeting on July the 11th, on a Tuesday evening, which is going to be in the hospital, in the cancer center, which is if you're looking straight at the hospital, it's the newest section of the building, separate being on the right-hand side, I think in the second floor conference center. I'm not suggesting carpetbaggers come, but you know, we're going to have a meeting with the idea of introducing, again, League of Women Voters in a place like Hancock, which used to be Democrat. Now, oh my God, people have said, oh, Betty, run for something. I couldn't run for a dog catcher. And I hate seeing this. I mean, I may embrace my politics, but I'm more concerned right now about crossing these bridges. And we want to see this happen again. I think gerrymandering will have the best opportunity in a place like Indiana if it is seen not as a partisan issue, because the harder we fight, it's going to be, oh, you sore losers.
Well, I would encourage you to reach out to your state representative, Bob Cherry, who is a Republican and is on record in support of an independent commission. So definitely bringing him in, getting him speaking about it will absolutely help it make it more bipartisan.
Wanted to share that I was very privileged to attend the June recognition brunch presented by the Indianapolis section of the National Council of Negro Women. The opening remarks were by Julia Vaughn, who is with WHMB TV 40, and they struck me as extraordinarily powerful. Ms. Vaughn said, "We must come together to talk, to listen, and to connect. In that way, we will become the great women we are meant to be." If positive changes are to be made in our state and our country, they will be made by women, those of us who are becoming the great women we are meant to be. Thank you so much for coming this evening, for caring about our democracy, and for your commitment to end gerrymandering. Have a great evening.